Dr. Kara, welcome.
Thank you.
Wonderful. How are you finding New Orleans?
New Orleans is great.
Uh-huh.
It's always good. Glad to have you here as well.
Yes. I'm very excited to be here. I've been here for a couple of weeks, and I've had the opportunity to interview some very great scholars that have been participating in this seminar. So now let's talk about your book, The Girls Next Door, Bringing the Home Front to the Front Lines. I had the opportunity to read this book a couple of days ago when it was assigned by Dr. Greg. But yeah, I did find it very interesting. You wrote in this book that women volunteered and were recruited to entertain and support male soldiers overseas during America's 20th century wars. The Second World War, the First World War, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. What significance does your narrative has on changes in assumptions about gender and sexuality in American culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was really interested, I guess what led me to write the book in the first place, I had written a book on nurses in the Vietnam War, American nurses. And I always was really intrigued by this idea that the military, even though they were nurses, still wanted them to look pretty, and smell nice, and all of these characteristics. And so I knew there were these women who were there strictly to entertain, and I wanted to look into the history of that. And so in starting with World War I and going all the way through Afghanistan, it was interesting to see some of the changes in the ways that these women are utilized and sort of the expectations of what they're supposed to do in the war. It fits the particular war in question, or even the theater of a particular war. But so many things remain, similar. So I won't say the same, but similar. Throughout the century, there's still this expectation that women represent home, right? And that we're going to send women to these war zones to remind our servicemen, mostly men, of home, give them something to think about, take their minds off the war, keep them out of trouble. It doesn't really work that way, but yeah, there's some similarities across the century, and then also, the way that these women's experiences, it varies a lot if you're in World War I France, or if you're in Korea, or if you're in Vietnam. So the similarities and differences, I think, are really intriguing.
So now, given that some of these men that went to fight the war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Second World War, in the First World War, they had families back home.
Right.
They had girlfriends back home, they had wives back home. How did that very fact of women volunteering or being recruited to go and entertain and be in the company of fighting men overseas, how was that received by the women that had husbands and boyfriends that were actually fighting overseas?
Yeah, they weren't all that pleased at times, right? Because you're sending these women over, they get to, in some ways, these men are just happy to see anybody from home, right? There's an element of that. But if you're the girlfriend or the wife back at home and you see pictures of sometimes scantily clad women, fraternizing with soldiers, that doesn't make you feel all that great. You're a little nervous. Part of the intent was to keep the boys out of trouble, right? Keep them out of trouble, keep them from getting diseases, keep them from causing problems where they are. But when you send women to do that work, in some ways women are the problem that you're trying to keep the men from, but you're using other women to solve that problem. It's a bit convoluted.
You also wrote that racial issues were again a problem, with many white women afraid or reluctant to interact with black men for fear of what white men would think or do.
Right.
How did this play out?
Yeah, that was another really interesting part of the book, because the military integrates in 48. It takes them a little while to enact this, but that raises all kinds of concerns from military officials. What does this mean if we're using women to represent home, if they embody all of these gendered norms, these sexual norms, and now we have an integrated military? And some women are okay with this, right? They see sort of this opportunity to interact with people they've never met before, they've never engaged with.
Mm-hmm.
But the way you phrase the question, that the other white men,
Mm-hmm.
they're the problems, right?
Yeah.
There are so many of these cases where you would have white girls from Kansas or wherever, and they've gone to Vietnam, and they're like, oh, we've met these new friends. We've never had friends who happen to be of a different race than us. And then the white soldiers walk in, and all of a sudden the situation changes. And those soldiers cause problems. Even in World War II, I'm thinking the USO, the Red Cross, all of these organizations said we're all for racial equality and we don't tolerate discrimination, and yet they segregate their clubs, or they allow white men to de facto segregate clubs that weren't segregated officially. And so race throughout is a really interesting thing. I think it's interesting as well when you think about putting white women in Pacific theaters or in different places, that race takes on different kinds of meanings even outside of American racial definitions. It takes on broader understandings of race worldwide, right? Which brings in colonialism, kinds of really complicated relationships.
Following demobilization and the end of the war, how were these women treated? Were they treated like veterans eligible for demobilization benefits, or they were just like ignored and their wartime roles forgotten?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. Yeah, they're never treated as veterans. It's interesting the way that their service gets talked about in the war is that this is valuable, this is a necessary thing that we're asking you to do. But at the end of each of those wars, they're not veterans. They don't get veterans benefits. They don't get health care. They don't get the GI Bill, right? There's not the formal kind of treatment.
Recognition.
Right? And for a lot of these women, it's hard to explain what you did, right? I went to war and served donuts. Well, how do you explain that to someone who wasn't there and doesn't understand that serving donuts meant something bigger than serving donuts, right? But it's a hard thing to explain. I was there and danced with troops or served Kool-Aid, or it's just a funny kind of thing. And so for a lot of women to come home and try to explain that, it's just difficult, and it doesn't. Even for women who might have been in the military and been on the home front, people understand what that work was and why it mattered. But women in the USO or Red Cross, that doesn't. It doesn't make sense as easily to a lot of people. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Kera, for your time. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks.